And in 2018 and 2019, it's like the universe stuck a key in my heart and turned it and reversed the flow. And now all that stuff that had been repressed, all that stuff that had been in the landfill was now actually flooding in this torrent, in this avalanche into my conscious awareness of all those things in my life that I didn't deal with earlier because I was so focused in my head. And so this reintegration process with my body, and in particularly with my heart and my gut, has been the heart and the gut finally reconnecting with the head and basically them catching up. It was the most overwhelming and honestly difficult experience of my life. As scary as the leukemia experience was, it was relatively short-lived, and I see the healing and awakening process as the gradual shifting away of all of the sense of separation, of concreteness, of permanence that we attach to things, and reconnecting to the truth that at the bottom of everything, beyond all form, we are all one, we're all eternal, we're all everlasting, and our truest name is love.
Joseph, welcome to the Way of the Heart.
Thanks so much for having me, Natalia.
I'm really excited for our conversation. Before we started recording, I was telling you that, first of all, I've been reading your book, which we will talk about during this time. And it's been so beautiful to witness you through your book and your creation. Many reasons. Of course, I do resonate with so many things that you share in the book. And your story is very inspiring and very unique. So before we dive into your story and your spiritual awakening, which was really the catalyst for you to create this work, I would love to know more about where you came from. Where were you born? How was your early years? How was your upbringing in general?
Yeah, I'm a beach boy. I grew up in Manhattan Beach, California, which is about 10 miles south of Santa Monica. And I just, the thing I really remember from my youth is just loving being by the ocean. In summertime, going down there, boogie boarding, playing football with my friends. And, it was the place where I really connected with nature. Burying my feet in the mud, getting out in the waves. I remember sometimes talking to the ocean as a child, and it's really, for me, so close to my heart. And, I still live by the beach. I live now in Oceanside, California, just a few miles away. And every time I'm close to the water, I just feel at home.
That's really nice. I did not grow up close to the water at all. But at least my parents were, I guess they wanted me to be close to water, and I started swimming really early. Like I was like a little baby when they took me to swimming lessons, but that's like the closest I was with water growing up. And I loved it, and I do love it now. So I can resonate with that connection to the water. I also do have a lot of respect for the water. So there's like that, that very, it's almost like an elder, like when you have that relationship of like love and respect. That's how I feel about the water. So there's something that stood out in your book and about your, the way that you perceived life before your spiritual awakening. So you didn't believe in anything. Why do you think that was? How was that part of your upbringing? Like, did you have any reference as far as like spirituality or religion that you were kind of like rebelling from?
Yeah, in a way, yes. So I was raised Roman Catholic. I went to a Roman Catholic grade school, and it was very much a part of my life, really from the beginning. I ended up going also to a Catholic high school, and I got my Master's of Fine Arts in Writing at the University of San Francisco, which is Jesuit. So Catholicism has been a common thread through much of my life. And, I followed a pattern I think is familiar for a lot of people, which is, early in life, I believed. I believed in God. I felt a connection to God and to Jesus. And sometime around junior high school, kind of a skepticism was born in me. And it was really that began to feel kind of a drift away from the belief in what I'd been told and what I'd come to accept as true, and really beginning to question it. And that persisted in me through my teens, through my 20s, and it wasn't really until my spiritual awakening process that changed.
Yeah, so far I've had many conversations in the podcast that it's similar. It's a similar story about an upbringing with a very specific faith, and then just questioning things along the way, and kind of like going completely to the other side of the spectrum, and maybe coming all back with a different perspective, but definitely coming back to that source. So let's talk about your spiritual awakening and the story and how that began, because it's a very inspiring story.
Thank you. Yeah. It was, feel myself getting a little emotional. One of the things that was got in a way so amazing about it and so scary about it was so sudden. I was in law school. This was back in 2010. I was attending the University of California, Berkeley, and I was 29 years old. And, I sat down to take my last final exam of the semester. It was an exam in evidence law. This was in December. And, for the past few months, something was wrong with me. I knew it. I'd been losing weight. I'd lost almost 20 pounds. I was having night sweats. I was generally a pretty healthy and athletic person, but I was really fatigued. I was actually having to stop a few times on the walk to school to kind of catch my breath. This never really happened to me before. So something was off, but, I was also a workaholic, and I was somebody who defined my worth in a large way by what I could accomplish. And the thing with law school was my final exams were worth 100% of my grade. So all the work I put in this semester, if I didn't sit down for that final and take it, I would basically have to do it again. And so something in me just said, put your head down, get through it. We'll go to the doctor afterwards. I kind of thought maybe it was mononucleosis or something like that. And, then I'll kind of get back on track. And so I finished that exam. And when I left the room, some classmates were like, hey, we're going to go to the bar and grab a drink. And I remember I told them, I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to swing by the student health clinic and, get some antibiotics or whatever, but I'll come meet you guys for that drink. And from there, a series of dominoes fell. They ran a blood test there at the clinic, immediately sent me to the hospital. I was admitted to the ER. And that night, I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. And I started chemotherapy the next day. And there was something that happened a few days into it. That was the beginning of the spiritual awakening, but that was kind of the lead up to it.
Wow. I cannot, even imagine how difficult those news and the process it was, just like so out of nowhere. And so quickly to kind of like your human to recognize what was happening, like I feel like the heart, which is really what I think is our doorway to our soul, has this immense infinite strength, and that's kind of like what keeps us going, but it's the human side that really struggles to catch up with that and to really understand what's happening. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I can definitely feel, that emotion and that impression that left in your spirit and in your, in your body, which makes your work so much more admirable, in my opinion. To me, it's like really, you're kind of like putting yourself raw out there with your own experience, and I really admire that.
Thank you.
You've mentioned in your book that there was something specific that happened in the hospital that kind of like started your spiritual awakening. What was this experience that you had?
Well, you actually just framed it so beautifully. It was this merging of my human self with my spirit self. And it happened a few days into my stay. The first few days I was in there was just this frenzy of activity around me. I was blessed to have a lot of friends and family come visit in those first few days. So there was always someone there to talk to. And, in the early stages there, while they were still getting me set up, figuring out my chemotherapy regimen, they were coming in, taking my blood, checking my vitals. So there wasn't really a whole lot of time for me to be by myself and to reflect or to dwell on what was happening. But it was a few days into the hospital stay that moment finally came. I remember it was sometime in kind of the mid or the late morning, and my doctor had been by for his rounds, my visitor had left for the day, my bed had been changed. And so something in me kind of sensed like, this is finally a little bit of downtime. And I remember I was lying on the hospital bed, and I began to feel this panic coming over me. We had done some research, and from the way the doctor had talked to us about it, we knew that this form of leukemia, acute myeloid leukemia, was especially lethal. And we were still waiting for some tests to come back to tell us exactly which variant I had. So my mind kind of fearfully went to the worst case scenario and imagined, this type of leukemia that, has a very high death rate. And what I began to think in my mind, this kind of runaway train of thoughts, was just like, you're going to die in this room. You're not going to live your life. It's going to end here. And that human part of me panicked. That part of me that thought that this is the only life there is. I kind of thought of things, and to some extent still do, in a materialistic way, slip into that way of thinking that this is it. And when this ends, I kind of thought like a fade to black and nothing after that, oblivion. It terrified me so deeply, and I felt what felt like an icy tentacle. I'm gripping my heart and my gut and my throat and just creating this squeeze and this vibration. And it felt like I was going to get almost just shaken out, kind of shaken into this state of losing myself. And as that reached a fever pitch, I'm lying in the bed, and all of a sudden there was this steadiness, this calmness. And I remember looking up, and I couldn't see anything. I didn't have a vision, but I just sensed to my core that there was a presence in the room above me, hovering right above my body. And that it was acting almost kind of like a blanket or a shield. And that fear that had been there, it was suddenly just like whoosh, very calm, very steady, very centered. And then I felt that presence descend into my body, and it was almost like a whoosh, like a wind going through and just blowing a room clean. And that icy tentacle that had been gripping everything was gone. Those runaway thoughts, those fears of death were just absent, just like that. And in its place was this voice coming from a place so deep inside of me and speaking in a manner so calm and so steady, and just said, "You're okay." And it said, whether you die in this room, whether you suffer in this room, you, on the deepest levels, are okay. And it was something that, honestly, Natalia, it didn't feel like someone was assuring me of this or telling me this. It felt like I was actually remembering something that I'd forgotten. Remembering a deep truth of who and what I am beyond this experience of this one life. And in a way, I really see that as the seed that was planted for my spiritual awakening. It would, like a lot of things, it would take time to really grow and flourish. And I think that process, candidly, is still unfolding. But that was the seed that's planted. And the work I do, I think, on the most fundamental level, is helping people tap into those depths inside of themselves that they haven't found a way to consistently reach yet, to unlock those deeper rememberings and realizations of who and what they are. Which, as I see it, is we are each the inspiring warmth of our hearts. And the more we connect with that truth and the more we live from that truth inside of ourselves, the less we live from our fear and reactivity, and the more we live from our authenticity and our confidence.
Wow. What a powerful experience. I'm curious if at any point after the experience happened, you were questioning it, or like you had any doubts, You did mention that it was more of like a remembrance, and I feel like sometimes we have this inner knowings, but I mean, I don't think I've had anything as profound as that, especially not in a I haven't experienced something as, where I'm literally fearing for my life. But whenever I do have moments of magic or moments in which I experience something like this, in which there is a remembrance, there's an inner knowing, my mind tends to question it. My mind tends to really go the other way and really start adding logic to it, and then the magic kind of like disappears. Did that happen to you at all?
In a way, the visual I'm getting, kind of going back to that image of like a plant, is like there was a taproot that went down and touched that truth inside of me. And I don't think that ever disconnected. But around it, a lot of that skepticism I had before, I continued after this to conceive of myself as an atheist. I got out of the hospital and I did make some major changes in my life. I became much more mindful. I began meditating consistently and making mindfulness a part of my daily routine. But I also went back to a lot of the destructive habits I had before I got leukemia and before I had that awakening experience. Workaholism being one of them, substance abuse. There were a lot, candidly. And it was one of those things where it was really almost kind of like the lightning, and then it took years for the thunder, and I still feel like the thunder is rolling through me from that flash. And the more it rolls through me, the more that kind of those fear-based ways of living, I'm feeling them gently kind of being pruned and softened away. But it's very much a process. I'm not finding it to be something that happens in a flash and then it's done. It's really kind of like a force of nature, something that happens like the seasons.
Yeah, I think that the example that you gave of the plant is definitely the closest that I usually refer to with the spiritual journey. It's something that you're watering every single day. And, nature, or our nature as human beings, is so beautiful that that seed is always going to be there. That potentiality is always going to be there because it's our soul. It's as long as we are, alive, that soul is going to be with us. But it really requires to show up for it and water it and just be there for it, pay attention to it. So you mentioned mindfulness, and you started to practice mindfulness when you had this experience. How did that begin? Was there someone that introduced you to mindfulness, or was that something that kind of like came from that experience that just naturally happened?
Yeah, it was from a book. When I was in the hospital, I was gifted with a number of books, and one of them was Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth. And, I'd never read a book like that, a book directly addressing consciousness and designed to help you tap into more expansive and higher states of consciousness. And, when I read that book, when I started, I was skeptical. I was honestly kind of rolling my eyes a little bit. I was, still kind of in that defensive position. But the more I got into the book, I actually really felt my mind expanding and broadening. And, I'd say for the first time in my life, I was kind of aware that I was aware. I was actually noticing my thoughts working through me. I was seeing the way my thoughts and my feelings were corresponding. And I was sustaining that observing position in a way I never had before. And I just sensed intuitively how empowering that was. And then as he talked about the importance of meditation and of doing things throughout the day to reconnect with your body, reconnect with your breath, and remain mindful, that was really coming out of the hospital. The thing that I really took with me is I said, I want to make this really a much richer part of my life. And so I joined a mindfulness club at law school when I re-enrolled, and I made mindfulness part of my daily routine for the years that followed.
So how was the unfolding after you left the hospital and after you started implementing these practices? How is that journey? How has that journey looked like?
Yeah, there were kind of like, like before a volcano erupts, sometimes there's like little earthquakes that they will see, and it'll kind of be a signal like, hey, something's about to happen. I had two of those earthquakes a couple years apart. In 2013, kind of picking up from law school, I passed the California bar exam. I got a job at the Santa Clara County Public Defender's Office. And shortly before I started the job, I admitted myself to urgent care and was ultimately taken to the hospital for symptoms that were essentially mimicking a heart attack. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest. There was pain radiating into my jaw and my limbs. I could not calm down. They ran the tests on me. I did the treadmill and everything, and they told me, they're like, "Man, your heart looks fine. It looks healthy. We think it's maybe just some kind of infection or irritation." And so I kind of put it behind me. And then a couple years later, I was at the public defender's office. I'd been working there a couple years, and the same thing happened. I checked myself to the ER one night because I was feeling that same thing. I mean, it felt almost like an elephant or something was like stepping on my chest. There was just this pressure and this squeeze that I couldn't bear. Same thing happened. They run the tests. Everything looks fine. In fact, they're like, "Dude, your heart actually looks pretty good. Like, we want to, use this as an example, for like a good looking heart." And so I was just kind of like, well, I don't know what's going on, but I'm not getting a diagnosis. So I just kept doing the same thing. I just kept going back to work and continuing. And in hindsight, these were the early rumblings of an eruption that happened in 2018 and 2019. And basically what happened there, it kind of ramped up over the course of weeks and months. Basically, the way I see it now is, I've always been a head person. I've been cerebral by nature. And one of the ways I sustained that was when difficulties or complications came up in my life, I kind of just pushed them down. Emotions I didn't want to deal with, conversations I didn't want to have, I just kind of dumped it down into my body. That way, the windshield wipers of my mind could be clear and clean. And in 2018 and 2019, it's like the universe stuck a key in my heart and turned it and reversed the flow. And now all that stuff that had been repressed, all that stuff that had been in the landfill was now actually flooding in this torrent, in this avalanche into my conscious awareness. And it was the most overwhelming and honestly difficult experience in my life. As scary as the leukemia experience was, it was relatively short-lived. This lasted and continues, candidly, for now 6 years, of a feeling that there is this constant upwelling and uppouring from my gut and my heart up through my head and really up out through my crown, of all those things in my life that I didn't deal with earlier because I was so focused in my head. And so this reintegration process with my body, and particularly with my heart and my gut, has been the heart and the gut finally reconnecting with the head, and basically them catching up, them sharing the memories and the experiences of life. The difficulty is for that, human part of me who's used to, wanting to be able to focus on demand, wanting to be able to work on demand, wanting to feel like things are clean and clear. It's not. It's messy. It's unpredictable. Sometimes it can be overwhelming. I need sometimes to take breaks and to relax. And this has really been teaching me humility and surrender in a very embodied way. And, candidly, it's been something I've come to very grudgingly. It's very difficult. I didn't want to lose that sense of control that I had, but life has been showing me that there's something so much richer beyond control, something so much more authentic and true and empowering for me and for everyone I interact with. And the challenge is, and you talked about it with watering the plant. For me, it's connection and surrender, connecting with my heart and then surrendering into that flow and trusting that what I truly need and what's truly right will come, instead of thinking that I have to master it or plan it out from my head.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't have said it better. What are some practices that you have cultivated to be able to connect with the heart and to be able to surrender?
Yeah, so a couple come to mind. One of them is this mantra that I love to use. For me, it's kind of my touchstone mantra, the one I come back to first. And it's soften, feel, and flow. Soften, feel, and flow. And what I love to do is I love to say the mantra a few times like that, sometimes silently, sometimes aloud. And then, always respectful of the moment, always keeping in mind the situation that I'm in. I try then to integrate some softening, some feeling and flowing into my moment. And, softening, one great one I found for me is softening 3 areas down my center line, softening the anus, softening the jaw, softening the eyes, and then letting those areas gently release the tension that we tend to hold there. And then when I move into feeling, I love feeling my body, especially my lower body. What I love about it is it's so silent, it's so simple. We don't have so much brain tissue there. It's very calm, it's very quiet. So I can just feel into that lower body, into my pelvis, into my legs, into my feet. And then I love to feel my heart beating. If I can, stop everything that I'm doing and just connect with the pulsing sensation of my heart. Sometimes I'll check my pulse or put my hand on my heart to help enrich that connection. And then the third part of that, which is really important, especially when we're in an interactive state, is flowing. When we're doing deep healing, we can stay in that heart connection and that open vulnerability for minutes, even hours at a time, and that can be deeply empowering. But in a state of interaction, I think it's always important to reconnect with the flow of activity, with the flow of life. And so that's really where the breath comes back in. And I love for this, putting my hands on my belly and trying to drive my breath, not by pulling in through my upper body, which we tend to do, pulling through the nose or pulling through the chest, but actually letting my belly extend out into my hands, having it expand like a balloon, and then that naturally allows the lungs to lower, creates a natural vacuum that draws air into the body on its own power, and then releasing. So when I do that sequence of soften, feel, and flow, even just for 10 seconds, I always feel a little closer to my heart. And the longer I do it, the stronger that connection grows.
I love that. I'm definitely going to write that down and practice that myself. I feel like the practice is beautiful, and at the same time, there are so many of us that are disconnected from the ability to just pause for a second and to really tune into our bodies and our heart and how we feel, right? Because sometimes what we experience is the reaction of the incapacity that we have to be with the feeling, to be with the actual sensation. And mindfulness for me has been, such a big gift to understand that it is with the facing of that emotion, with the sensation. It is the facing with the uncomfortable feeling that is going to actually allow us to build that muscle of just strengthening the capacity to be with it and to be resilient, emotionally resilient, right? So I really love that. And I love the part of surrendering. I recently heard someone talk about not lying as a form of practice of surrendering. And the way that they explained that was when we are truthful, fully, in a way we are allowing life to unfold the way it's meant to. Because when we lie, we're in a way controlling the reaction that someone else is going to have, the idea that they're going to have of us, the perception that they're going to have of us. So we're controlling, right? We're trying to manipulate. And when we are fully truthful, when we are fully in the flow, then that is a form of surrendering. That is a form of trusting that things will happen the way that they need to happen. So I think that for some reason, I just connected those two things, your practice and what I heard the other day, because I think that, a lot of our fear and that stress and tension that we experience on a daily basis is from gripping, right? Gripping the way that we think things need to unfold. So I really love that practice. And you mentioned something, and when you said flow, you mentioned something that reminded me of something you mentioned in the book, and I'm going to try to find exactly what it was, which I thought was so interesting that I would love for you to expand on it a little bit more. So you mentioned that creation flows in two ways, and I found that fascinating, and I would love for you to expand a little bit on that.
As I see it, as I experience it, creation flows in the flow of expression and in the flow of experience. And we as individuals sense the flow of expression as an inside out experience. So, for example, me talking to you right now, I'm experiencing this as an out movement of my thoughts to my words out to the computer to connect with you. So I'm expressing it out. And then likewise, when you're speaking to me, that's coming to me in the flow of experience. I'm accepting that as an outside in dynamic. I'm receiving your words into my mind and taking them in then as information. And the reason I think it's helpful to look at it this way is, first, it helps us have a framework to differentiate between those two flows, because just having awareness, conscious awareness of what's happening in the moment, being able to say, okay, this is my flow of expression, this is my flow of experience, just that puts us into that observer mode, takes us out of being too caught up in our reactivity, and lets us have a little bit of awareness of the situation. And so I think that's the first level on which this teaching can be empowering. The core of the teaching, though, is that the flows of expression and experience actually flow as one single flow in the heart. And so if we're experiencing expression and the flows of expression and experience as different, if we're noticing a stark contrast, right, and we're obsessed with, for example, what we're saying, but we're kind of tuning out what's coming in, or we're only taking in what's coming in and we're not paying attention to what's coming out from us, our thoughts and our feelings, we're disconnecting from something. And that for me is a mirror image reflecting that we're stuck, over-concentrated in our heads or in our guts. We're preoccupied with some problem, some fear, some difficulty. And that is causing us to look at the world through a scarcity or fear-based mode. And in that mode, we feel like we have to choose between expression and experience. Right? In conversation, do I focus on what the person is saying to me or what I'm planning to say next? And I think we all know from experience, when we're anxious, we tend to really become obsessive about these sorts of things. We can almost become neurotic about it. And what I've consistently found is, when I reconnect with my heart, when I live more from that heart space, when I'm focused less on trying to project and anticipate and really just more on feeling and staying in the moment, expression and experience merge into a single flow. And I'm not then trying to divide my attention between what's coming out and what's coming in. I'm just experiencing the constant interplay of those two, almost like one river flowing. And that's such a liberating state. I think so much of our anxiety and our neuroticism and our difficulty with mental health comes from this constant back and forth between managing what's going on inside of us and trying to manage what's happening in the world. But in the surrendered state of the heart, that flower fully opens and we realize there really fundamentally is no difference. All those senses of separation are the result of fear-based thinking in the mind. And in the surrendered state, we truly experience the oneness of what is, and the merging of those flows is how we feel that oneness inside of us.
That was so beautifully explained. And I was able to visualize what you were saying. And I'm going to try to remember this image that I had as you were explaining this, as I am experiencing that resistance and that friction between, the expression and the experience, because I definitely am aware that that happens. I think mindfulness, to bring it back, is the tool that is going to allow us to kind of like show the red flag of this is happening. And what can you do in that moment, right? What can you do? And then I think the surrendering part comes into play, which you already shared with us, that whole practice. I absolutely love the way that you explained that. And I think, you focus on your book. You have a lot of interesting topics, but you talk about the mind. And, in that same chapter, you talk about the heart. And, we've been talking about the heart a lot. How can we understand the mind? And how can we understand how that is different or separated from source? Mm-hmm. And what is source, even, to add there?
Yeah, so I'd like to paint a picture. Source, they talk about in Taoism, the Tao that can be named and the Tao that cannot be named. And the Tao that cannot be named is referring to Source. And the reason is Source has no space, Source has no time, Source has no form. What Source is the pure potential for all things to be. And it is from that nothingness, that all-containing nothingness, that everything we experience bursts into form. And there are two different modes of experience that we as human beings have in what we could call this collective dream of Source. And I call it a dream because all these experiences we have, they're quite literally temporary. Right? They have a beginning, they have a middle, and they will have an end. What never ends is the fundamental truth of all of us as this oceanic consciousness of Source. And what we're doing here in life is we're actually Source assuming particular forms to experience the wholeness and the beauty of what we are. And life is this experience, this gradually reconnecting with the oneness and the wholeness that's truly at the root of what we are. And I see the healing and awakening process as the gradual shifting away of all the sense of separation, of concreteness, of permanence that we attach to things, and reconnecting to the truth that at the bottom of everything, beyond all form, we are all one, we're all eternal, we're all everlasting, and our truest name is love. And now what we're doing now is we're incarnating in this collective dream of Source. This now is Source. Source isn't somewhere out there creating a Wi-Fi feed to create this. This is Source. We're in the ocean. And right now, so immersive is this dream, so impressive is our artistry, that we're convinced we're just human beings, just living these lives, right? We don't remember what became before, although sometimes through past life experiences, we can get glimpses of that. We don't really know what comes afterwards, although through faith and through spiritual experiences, we can get a sense of that. But we give ourselves this gift. The gift of forgetting. The gift of immersion. And in that immersive state, this is a state we're in right now, we experience things as body and we experience things as mind. From our perspective here as humans, the mind is what's abstract. The mind is what's not tangible. It's those experiences we have that are more conceptual, things like thoughts, things like memories, things like imaginings, things like dreams. We can have emotional reactions to them in the body, but they themselves are not physical experiences. They're more etheric. The bodily experience is the physicality, the density, what's tactile, right? What we can hear, smell, taste. And the body itself is the part of the universe, the stitch of the universal fabric through which we individuals connect with that whole that we are. And so really the way I like to think of mind and body is just as two different perspectives for consciousness to experience the universal dream. In the mind perspective, we experience the universal dream in its abstract form. In the bodily perspective, we experience in its physical form. And in the heart, and more specifically in the sacred heart, at that sacred mesh point where the heart and the soul meet. Because I see the soul as a species of mind, and the heart as a species of body. And that sacred place where they connect is that sacred fountain of creation, that connection to Source that lies within each of us, and that place of authenticity where we can flow as individuals. And just as the flows of expression and experience flow as one in the heart, when we're fully connected to our heart, we realize that mind and body are actually one. They're just two different aspects, two different ways of experience the one thing, which is truly nameless, but which some of us call God, some of us call Source, and which I've been taught is most truly called love.
I usually, towards the end of the episodes of the conversations, I ask 3 questions, and you have already responded all of the questions that I was gonna ask at the end, which is basically, what is the heart? What is love? So you have just journeyed through that already, which I absolutely love. I mean, I could really hear you talk about this. It really is it's like what you explained before. It's like that inner knowing, that remembrance. Sometimes you hear people speak and you feel it in the body. The body's experience is showing you something, is expressing something. And I'm definitely having that experience right now as you speak. There was a beautiful analogy that you used in the book about the moon and a pond. And I think it was also explaining about this. Would you like to share that? Because I thought that was so beautiful.
Gladly, yes. So it's an analogy about the relationship between source, the mind, and the universe. And we could see moon being like source, mind being like a pond, and the universe being like the reflection that's created from the pond's surface. And so the light from the moon shines and arrives at the pond. If the pond water is disturbed, if there's waves or ripples on the pond's surface, then what we see in the reflection is a dampened or distorted image of the moon. In fact, on a particularly windy night, you may not even recognize the moon at all when you look at the pond. And what I see that reflecting for us as truth is that when our minds are disturbed, when our minds are fixated on seeing problems, on being preoccupied with trying to fix the world, trying to make things conform to the way we're sure that they should be, when we're stuck in the past because of traumas that we haven't fully made peace with and fully surrendered, or we're fixated on the future, obsessing over something that's going to happen because we think that's the thing that's finally going to put us on the right track or finally make things better in our lives. These are all like winds that blow across that pond, make that surface wobbly, and then make that reflection wobbly too. And so I think if we look at the state of humanity right now, and if we look inside of ourselves right now and look at a lot of the difficulties we're experiencing emotionally, a lot of the fears and the phobias we're having, really this upheaval that's going through humanity, and I think is being reflected in some of the environmental traumas that the earth itself is experiencing. These to me are all reflections of this windy state in the mind, this pond of the mind being disturbed. And that then results in us looking at the world and we say, honestly, something is seriously wrong here. There's seriously something off or wrong with this. And the deepest truth I know is that all sense of offness, of wrongness, of problematizing is always a reflection of a disturbance in the mind. It's not a reflection of source, and it's not even a reflection of the universe. It's always something in the mind that is creating this reflection that's off. By contrast, when the pond is smooth, when the mind is fully surrendered, when the mind accepts the perfection of all occurrence, when the mind simply accepts and recognizes and stays in a state of feeling and noticing, those pond waters grow stiller and stiller. And as people who meditate deeply know, as people who have done some psychedelics or other healing medicines know, you can reach a state of stillness in the mind where you can open your eyes and look out at the world. And that same world that just minutes ago seemed like it had so many problems, it seemed like a never-ending list of woes. All of a sudden you look at it and you realize it's beautiful and perfect and unimprovable, exactly as it is. And so I think this analogy for me is just a really empowering way to remember that anytime I'm trying to take a problem and trying to buy into blame, trying to get myself worked up into rage, that if I really want to get to the root of that, right, we can play those games as long as we do. Candidly, I still do. But when I really want to heal and I want to get clear, I go within and I look in my mind and I try to find the disturbance there. And the more I do that and then reconnect back to my heart and try to flow with mindful presence, then the world seems more like what it is, which is the loving gift of Source.
I kept thinking about something that, compared to what you just said, is going to be almost funny. But I'm thinking about an experience I had guiding my brother in a mindfulness meditation practice. And he had so many things to do. He had so much work that at the end, when we finished the meditation, he said, for the first 10 minutes, all I could noticed was my mind just like thinking about all of the things that I needed to get done. And I was getting really anxious because I was remembering that I didn't do something, that I had to do another thing. And then towards the end, something shifted, and I was so grateful to have all of those things, to be able to have a to-do list where before he was scared to never have enough, work or, freelance jobs to sustain himself. And this comes to me because I feel like it's like such a small example of what you're talking about, how the mind can really perceive things from that fear-based perspective, that anxiety, that chaotic place, or from a place of nothing really has changed as far as, like the facts haven't changed. Right. The things are still happening. But can we actually shift the perspective and see it from a different lens? And how is that going to propel to create the next present moment, basically? Right? There's a quote that one of my teachers said, and I'm probably going to say it wrong, but it was something like, all we need to do is take care of this present moment. As long as we're taking of this present moment, the next present moment is going to be taken care of. Mm-hmm. And I think that, that for whatever reason, that example of my brother just having that experience came to me as you were explaining that. And I find that really, what is so beautiful about this work that we have in common, being mindfulness practitioners, and really getting familiar with the mind. I feel like the more I learn about the mind, the more I get familiar with it, the more it allows me to understand my heart, because it allows me to discern, and it really allows me to see how they're both so different and similar at the same time, right? Mm. They're really providing here something, but it really allows me at least to see the differences. There was another thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking, and there's a chapter in your book where you talk about fear and ego. And I feel like those two concepts, they're not concepts, those are experiences as well. When I started to learn about it, it really helped me navigate this human experience in a completely different way.
Yeah. The definition of fear and ego that has come to me and that makes the most sense to me is really in addiction. Zooming out, all being source, fear and ego too are source. They're forms of God's love that come to us. And so I think it's always important to remember that before we go in, because what fear and ego are essentially doing in this human form is keeping us in this state of suffering. And the way they do that is, I see fear is basically source, God, us, addicted to negativity, to anti, to not, to looking at what is either in the world or in the mind and to finding problems with it. Not big enough, not strong enough, not fast enough, not soon enough, not. And by doing this, it quite literally creates almost this kind of backwards indent in the mind. It creates this kind of pressure, pushing, because it's asking us to believe something that's impossible, that something could not be. If we look out at physical experience, right, and this is a challenge I give to you, find not. It's actually nowhere to be seen. We say the word, but what is, right? The mind can look, for example, at a bowl and can say, oh, okay, there's grapes and there's an apple and there's an orange, but there's not a mango, right? And to us, that's all makes sense, right? We can kind of flow in conversation with that. But if you really slow down and think about it, what is there are those fruits, and then that space in the bowl where there's air, maybe there's a fruit fly or something there. But that mango is in the mind, and it's fear that's trying to tell us, there's something that should be there, but isn't. And so this addiction to negativity that lies deep in us, I feel it butting up right against the edge of my heart, is what is constantly pulling us out of that heart flow, out of that state of acceptance of what is, and into problem-solving mode. And this is where we get shot up into our heads or down into our guts to fix some problem that fear has convinced us we have to address. Ego, I kind of think of ego like the magician's assistant, right? Ego is addicted to fear. Ego wants to keep us in this constant state of fearing, this constant state of scarcity, this constant state of leaving the heart and going up into the mind or down into the gut. And so what ego does is it constantly misdirects our attention away from the true cause of our suffering, which is this unhealthy relationship we have with fear, this clinging to those disturbing vibrations of fear, and this believing, this constantly buying into fear's claim that there's something wrong here, that something is not right, that things should be different than they are. And so we need to leave our hearts, leave our state of calmness and trust, and go into a problem-solving mode. And so ego is the master at constantly diverting our attention because we want to stop suffering. We say, well, how do I stop this? And it says, oh, change that person. Have this political argument, change that person's mind, right? Clean up this environmental issue, right? And all of those things can be things that we enjoy as human beings, but none of those things fundamentally heal our suffering because our suffering is an internal phenomenon driven by this unhealthy relationship with fear. And we can give ego its credit. And again, we are the artists of it. We are all God. We are all creating all aspects of our experience, including fear and ego. Ego is a master, a prodigy, and so fast, so resourceful, so clever at taking our mind's eye, that observing part of our mind that wants to look down into the heart and realize, this is where my suffering is happening, in this constriction and in this believing, and it constantly externalizes it onto other things. People in the world, situations in the world, things in our past that we're not at peace with, things in the future that we're going to fear. Ego is constantly taking this mirror and redirecting our attention in all these different ways to get us to react, to provoke us into a fear-based response so that ego can keep its drug flowing, which is fear. And so fear can keep its drug flowing, which is negativity. And so the art of healing, going back to what we've been talking about this whole time, mindfulness is being able to recognize fear and ego at work, recognizing those scarcity framings that the mind is putting up. And then the heart-based practice, surrender, is letting go of those fears, letting go of those thoughts, and trusting that where we serve ourselves and others best is in connection and in flow with our hearts. Not in the problem-solving mode, not in the mode of trying to be the hero for the world, of being the inspiring warmth of our hearts. And from there, we're our true authentic selves. The gifts that are most important for us to be able to share in that moment are right there and available. They flow naturally from us. And we're truly present, truly available to be of service to others, not from an agenda, but from love.
Something is coming to me because I know this is a question that I do get asked when I talk about these similar concepts and really acting from the heart. And I say acting because, and by that I mean taking action. Because a lot of people think that connecting with these ideas and practicing spirituality and having this type of approach to life makes us really passive. How would you explain this to people when they say that this is kind of like a passive way to approach life and we're not doing anything to help? Or, people that say that you're meditating and by meditating, you're really not doing much. How do you approach this type of conversations?
Yeah, I think it's a common misconception. I know that I've had it myself, and the way that makes the most sense to me is the difference between freezing and flowing. What we can do to try to imitate a state of stillness or a state of calmness is to clench ourselves tight and freeze. Deliberately refrain from taking any activity. We predetermine ourselves. And notice this is actually us following an agenda, right? So we're already out of our hearts. We're in the head of the gut, believing we need to do something. And in that state, trying to make a certain impression, trying to give off a certain image, we sit in this tight stuckness. And it may look to an outside observer, especially someone who doesn't know what to look for, like stillness, but it's actually a form of fear. It's a form of freezing. What true surrender is an opening and allowing of this flow of creation to move through the heart, There's always a river of feelings flowing through the heart. But we as a species, and especially as a society these days, are so absorbed in our heads and our guts that river, sometimes we don't even feel it there. Or it's so distant, it's so faint, it doesn't feel real, it doesn't feel powerful, it doesn't feel like something we can live from. But the more we cultivate this sacred heart connection, what we realize we're doing is we're surrendering into this flow. And in that flow, nothing is lost. We still have our minds, we still have our bodies, we still have our thoughts, we still have the things we love and that we care about. We're not living as some blank slate that's constantly being rewritten. We are who we truly are. It's just we're living from that state of feeling more than the state of agenda. And that's where we're able then to flow with authenticity and to act from our passions, from our integrity, and from what truly matters to us, making choices that we can really be proud of because we didn't get carried away trying to serve some external cause or another. We were living quite literally from our felt truth in the moment.
And just to end with something practical, and you already mentioned something about mindfulness and working with ego and fear. How can we work with this as we notice it, even if we have the mindfulness of it, to be able to notice as we are going to this place of just being very logical, analytical, having the agenda? In a way, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but as long as we are human beings, or unless we are really advanced and enlightened in a way, fear and ego are still going to be here, and we're still going to have to work with them somehow, right? How can we work with that?
Yeah, and I think you nail it on the head. It's work with it. Because if we think about it, right, come back to the heart's deepest truth, which is acceptance. There's this subtle trick that fear and ego play. And again, if we think of fear and ego as performers, if you think of them, we have the Olympics on right now. If you think of them as the world-class athletes of convincing you that what's not true is true, you can actually recognize a very subtle game that they play, which is turning you against your own fear and ego. Turning fear and ego into the enemy, that's just a fear and ego game too. They don't care. They don't mind being the victims. As long as they're getting what they want, which is ego wants fear, fear wants negativity, they're totally cool with running this campaign, being anti-fear, getting rid of ego in the world. That's all a fear and ego game. This is why surrender is so important. That's why it's really about the heart instead of the mind. What I found again and again, I started thinking of the ego as my dark sensei, as this figure who, when I tried to go into the mind, and I tried to argue with the ego, I tried to pretend the ego wasn't there, I tried to convince the ego of what is true, it would just demolish me. It was like a black belt against a brand new beginner. It just toyed with me and played with me. And being a cerebral person by nature, this, and continues to be honestly, something that is so at first humiliating and then humbling for me, which is to realize, that's never really where my truest power was. It was always down here. It was always in my flow. And so if you think of the ego at the deepest level as something that's trying to get you to say, up here, right, over-concentrate in the head or down here in the gut, this is my territory. This is not yours. If you're here, you're under my rule. If you go back to your heart, everything opens to you. And so on the deepest level, if we see them as our teachers and guides, and their methods, they teach by infliction. They're brutal. They don't pull punches. But they will remind you again and again and again and again and again that this is where you do the most good. And so I think that's the first layer at the deepest level of acceptance, is not demonizing fear and ego any more than you have to, because that demonizing is a fear and ego game. See them instead as these teachers. And then cultivating mindful presence. If you can see it in action, if you can see the agendas forming inside of you and recognize your ability to observe it, just that act of observing gives you that little bit of distance where you're not so immediately carried away with it. And then the third piece we've been talking about is then surrendering back into the heart. Because even staying in that observer mode, the longer we do that, ego will start wrapping its way in there too. Start telling us that this is where we need to stay. We need to be observing phenomena. You can see there's actually a subtle fear to that, kind of a vigilance. Like I need to be watching. I need to watch for the danger, right? That's more fear and ego. So see that observer mode as a transition, a necessary transition back into the surrendered state of the heart. And if what we're doing is less thinking, less speculating, less considering. And what we're doing is we're more feeling, we're more connecting, we're more literally quite touching those feelings that are flowing through our hearts. Those for me have become the indicators, kind of like when pilots fly in bad weather, they learn to read their instruments when they can't see through the windshield. That's my instrument that I read. Am I feeling? Am I flowing? Am I connected? Or am I trying to play some game or win some war or hold some position in my mind? And again, fear and ego are those teachers who show, here's where your power is. Here's where you belong.
So powerful. I am definitely using a lot of what you have shared today personally in my life. I'm going to keep reading your book. I am going to keep, being a witness of your work, because I find so many of the things that you are sharing, if not all of them, so powerful and so needed in my life, and of course in the way that we are just kind of like reacting as society with everything that is happening around us. Is there anything that you want to share? You work with clients. Is there anything that you want to share with the audience on how you can help serve people, and where can they find you and all of that, so that they can contact you and work with you?
Gladly. Thank you so much. So first, I will direct you to my book, which Natalia has been talking about. It's called Soul. It's spelled S-O-L, the Spanish word for sun. The subtitle is Supportive Guidance for Healing and Awakening. And again, my name's Joseph Clarke. There's an E on the end. You can find that book through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or authorhouse.com. And then I work as a spiritual healer, and my specialty is helping people strengthen their connections to their beautiful and powerful hearts. I do that through one-on-one services, working with clients, both in person and over Zoom. And the three modalities I use to help people strengthen their heart connection is Reiki energy healing, which I can do at distance anywhere in the world. I do mindfulness coaching on techniques like breath work and meditation and self-healing methods. And then I have heart-to-heart dialogues, much like the conversation we've been having here, where the focus is on the struggles and the desires that my client is feeling in that moment. And through those combination of methods, what I'm seeing happen for my clients is they're living more and more from their hearts. And they're doing things like overcoming addictions, breaking out of patterns of stuckness and procrastination. They feel like they can't get out of the house and walk. They're afraid to have conversations with loved ones. With that stronger heart connection, they're breaking through that fear and they're doing those things they truly want to do. And the third main benefit I'm seeing is it's helping people enrich the relationships that matter most to them. I work with a lot of fathers, especially, who have young kids and who are married. And especially males in this society, we tend to be so work focused and so caught in our heads and our guts that it's hard when we get home, especially after a stressful day, to connect with our spouses and our kids on a heart-to-heart level. And that's one of the great joys of my job. I'm a husband and a father myself, so that part speaks especially deeply to me, is helping them cultivate that heart connection so that when they get home, they feel like they have a language they can speak and a mode they can move in, where they actually feel like they're part of the family instead of kind of this father figure who's sometimes in the orbit of the family, which I think us guys tend to get into. And if you are interested in learning more about me and my services, I offer a free consultation. You can go to my website. So it's my name, Joseph Clarke with an E, -spiritualflourishing.com. Joseph Clarke -spiritualflourishing.com. You can also Google Joseph Clarke Spiritual Flourishing. It'll show up pretty close to the top. And then the last resource I'll share is my Instagram page. My handle is @spiritflourish. @spiritflourish.
Joe, we'll have all of this information on the show notes as well, so people can find you easily. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I am honored to be able to have this conversation and to hear and listen to all of the wisdom that you have shared with us today. Thank you so much for your presence, for your energy, for your work, for your time having this conversation. I really appreciate you.
You're so welcome. And I just want to say thank you for holding such a safe and supportive space. As you saw, some of those topics, especially the ones we talked about at the beginning, are very difficult for me, but I felt safe going there because of the energy that you're holding. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for holding such a safe space.
Thank you for sharing Thank you so much.